Joining me here at the table, Lee Fang, an investigative reporter who has spent the last 3 years covering the Koch brothers. Also, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center and professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg Center for Communications. Alicia Menendez, host of HuffPo Live. And Peter Edelman, law professor at Georgetown Law. Thanks to all of you for being here. Lee, I want to start with you. You were thrown out of one of these Koch brothers' secret meetings. Tell me about that.
Well, you know, I found out about the similar event that happened in January in Indian Well. And given the importance of these meetings and how they affect public policy, I decided to try to check myself into the hotel and attend and find what I could report. Unfortunately, they threw me out. And the few details I was able to find, I went to the airport there and just kind of cataloged the planes as they came in to figure out, you know, who are these donors?
Right.
Because it's 100% secret. But, you know, 2 years ago, I was the first to report a brochure that explained what really goes on at these events. And that's kind of how the public started to take an interest.
Yeah, and so Koch brothers is a name that probably most New Yorkers, for example, know from their philanthropic work, right? So sort of before you started doing this kind of investigative reporting, if I said Koch brothers, you would think about, you know, the Koch brothers as arts patrons, or you would think about the Koch brothers as hospital, you know, emergency room patrons. Why are, and the reason you know it is because their names are on their philanthropic work, right? They have plaques to them. Why then keep the political work so secret? Why be so non-transparent about that?
Well, here's one important detail of the Koch meetings. The person who hands out the grants to think tanks, to these issue ad groups, to some of these grassroots organizations, these two gentlemen named Richard Fink and Kevin Gentry, they're the philanthropy heads of Koch Industries, but they also double as some of the chief lobbyists at Koch Public Industries. So their main job is to advance the business interests of Koch Industries. So a lot of this quote-unquote philanthropy isn't necessarily for the public interest, it's for the private business interests of that multinational conglomerate that is Koch Industries and many of their allies.
Right, so we get in trouble sometimes when we're trying to kind of, you know, trace what's going on with Koch money, and we'll often hear, well, look, you know, private industry or private individuals giving money to public concerns is part of what America is. Is there something different about what's going on with Koch?
There is. I mean, when you look at their philanthropy, it is in fact philanthropic. That which happens publicly, what happens behind closed doors, is very much in the interests of an elite set of people. It's funny that we talk about transparency because we know what they're talking about. They're talking about deregulation. They're talking about making sure that things like the estate tax are not renewed in the next Congress. They are exclusively looking at things that benefit a very small portion of people, and that's why they don't want it to be out there in the public.
So what's wrong with that? Okay, if I am a wealthy person, I'm an American, I have interests, and my interests are in the estate tax, because I actually have an estate to pass on. What's wrong with me using the resources that I have to bring to bear? I mean, if I'm an older person who is relying on Social Security, I get together with my friends at the AARP, and we try to, you know, address things that will address older folks. If I'm in the NAACP, we're going to try to make sure we've got racial justice happening. How is it that Koch brothers is somehow different from these other organized interest groups which will use whatever resources they have, whether it's money or whether it is the issue of, you know, sort of being able to mobilize voters?
May I give an anecdote? Yeah. In 2010, the Koch brothers secretly funded a group called the Regulation Reality Tour. They were sponsoring a bus tour in pivotal states where they wanted to pressure senators to pass legislation to restrict the EPA from being able to regulate carbon emissions, a big priority for Koch Industries. But the group went out and they dressed as EPA police, and they would go out to people. It was kind of street theater, and they said, if the EPA is allowed to move forward, the EPA will send these carbon police to your church and shut down your church. They'll shut down your refrigerator. They won't allow you even to breathe because you breathe carbon dioxide. They used a lot of misinformation, and they never said that who they were really being funded by. Big conglomerate that had a big stake in these EPA rules.
So is it misinformation? Is that the real issue, not their secrecy, not that we can't press our nose up against a window because we don't know what window the building might be on because we don't know where the meeting is happening? But is it because they're using misinformation?
Here's what we can say historically. When you get further removed from the candidate, you become more attack-driven and you become more deceptive. You do that on the left and you do that on the right. When advertising moves to political parties from candidates in 1996, higher level of attack, higher level of deception. When PACs emerged, same thing happened. Issue advocacy groups, same thing happened. And what you're seeing now is the distinction between C4s, which don't have to disclose anything, and super PACs and groups who you can at least identify, AFSCME, American Federation of State Local Municipal Employees. And what we saw when we looked at that pattern in this year, up to the top 4 spending super PACs, top 3, and then AFSCME, because that was in fact the 4th on the list. For the primary period through Wisconsin, we found 57% of their advertising contained at least one deception called out by one of the fact-checking organizations. C4s, no disclosure.
Right. So in other words, so if we're talking about a C4, if we're talking about not the campaign, but something that is farther removed from the candidate, then you're more likely to end up with commercials, advertising that actually says something that is at least somewhat deceptive as it's trying to make its claim.
That at least one of the fact-checking groups considered to be deceptive. And so what you're seeing is anonymity tends to breed attack and deception. And we ought to, I think, worry about deception wherever we find it. And we ought to worry about this relationship between anonymity and deception.
That's a great point. We're going to talk more about the Koch brothers, and I want to point out that we did invite the Koch brothers or one of their representatives to come on the show, and they declined, but they did send us a response, and I'm going to read that response, so don't go away. Political gathering, maybe, being held in San Diego by billionaire businessmen Charles and David Koch. And we invited the Koch brothers or a representative to join us today on the show. Now, they declined our invitation, but sent us a statement. We agreed to read an excerpt from that statement on the air. The statement reads, Charles Koch and David Koch are publicly and consistently advocated for limited government, individual liberty, and economic freedom for more than 50 years. During that time, they have opposed policies that are counter to these principles, regardless of whether Democrats or Republicans were in power. They have long supported a variety of groups that analyze and advance thoughtful, reliable, free market solutions to the pressing economic problems facing our country. Charles Koch and David Koch support these groups because of their desire to restore this great country to the principles of individual liberty and freedom upon which it was founded, and to put a halt to the rampant and unchecked growth of government, which threatens all Americans' future prosperity. Now, you can actually read their entire statement to us. It is up on our website at mhpshow.com. Still with me are Lee Fong, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, Alicia Menendez, and Peter Edelman. So we wanted, I was really excited about the idea of a Koch brothers representative being here because I feel like everybody ought to have their say. We gave them an opportunity with the statement, but they also very pointedly sort of went around the table. We told them who else we would be speaking with, and at each point they suggested that everyone else at the table was also guilty of all of the things that we are suggesting that they are guilty of here, which is secrecy and not disclosing. So they said, for example, that Lee, that your employer, the Center for American Progress, as well as the United Republic, don't disclose your donors. Alicia Menendez, that your former employer, the New Democratic Network, keeps their donors' contributions not public. And then they said of us as professors that we go to academic conferences that do not allow the media. And I just can't even imagine what the media would want to know about what goes on in our... I actually think we'd be really excited to have some press at our conferences, even if we would have very low ratings. So what say you to these statements by the Koch brothers Foundation?
Well, I couldn't wait to hear what the accusation would be in my case.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I work for a university. I'm chair of a foundation. Everything that I do, I am on the board of the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Everything I do discloses where their money comes from completely.
Yep.
And, you know, I work for United Republic. We disclose our donors, so I'm not sure where Koch is getting their facts. But it's hard to trust the Koch PR shop. You know, in 2009, they put out aggressive statements to the media saying, we have nothing to do with the Tea Party. We demand a correction for anyone who associates us with the Tea Party. Now they say we're proud to support the Tea Party, and we've always financed them.
Yeah, and, you know, the Tea Party one is maybe the one well, there's a lot that irritate me, but it's one of the ones that irritates me the most because, you know, to the extent that the Tea Party was a grassroots movement that came up sort of legitimately from folks who lost, but said I still have a voice, in that sense, I would support the Tea Party, not substantively, but in their right to have a voice even if you lose an election. But to the extent that they are backed and funded by very powerful interests who make them appear to be grassroots when in fact they're not, I find that much more distressing.
Right, and it goes back to your point about their misinformation and their theatrics, which is they've done a very job of selling misinformation as absolute fact, including this entire meme that the Tea Party is completely homegrown.
Yeah, so despite the fact that they don't disclose everything, we do have some numbers. And so this is actually from the Center for American Progress Action Fund, who talks about where the Koch financial influence goes, that there's $85 million donated to right-wing think tanks and advocacy groups, $45 million spent in the 2010 midterms, another $2.1 million spent in the 2010 midterms through direct donations, 1.2 to governors in 2010, 5.2 to state elections, 395 million for a spending goal for 2012. Now, you know, when you look at sort of each individual congressman, each individual senator, sometimes it adds up to nothing more than $2,500, $4,000, and you think you're not buying a lot of influence for $4,000. But when you look at 395 million as their spending goal in 2012, I just sort of wonder what else is there that can even counter such a powerful force.
Especially since they've been doing this for a very long time, right? Progressives, it's taken them much longer to come to the table with a rebuttal to this. So when you look at that first number, which represents the largest portion of all of this, that's infrastructure that they've been building for the last 20 years. And that now is paying off in dividends, whether that is legislation that they've been crafting at their think tanks that now shows up in Congress. You know, sometimes you think that these pieces of legislation that a congressman's really just sitting at their desk, right? No, these come from these places, and these organized efforts come from these places. And that is the thing that progressives will have a very hard time responding
But are
to.
we just mad because as progressives we don't have rich Koch brothers? So as I was reading your book last night, Peter, I'm reading about the Fields and the Fords, and the fact is that there's a ton of money on the left, although it's not a ton, it's actually a little dribble of money on the left that helps to fund, you know, progressive policy making. Are we just hating, like, because we don't have folks this rich to push our agenda?
Well, no. All of the things that that's the Marshall Field family of Chicago, the New York branch was very liberal, did their giving through publicly disclosed foundations. Every grant they made was reported. Everything they did was knowable. This is totally different. And what you have here, which is so important to this conversation, is that some of the individual things they're doing are fine. It's the aggregate, and the aggregate is fueled and supported and enabled by Citizens United. Yeah. So at the heart of this is the fact that so much of the money is not the $2,500 that goes to the individual congressperson. Yep. It's all the stuff that's not disclosed, and that's just flooding the whole political process, plus the lack of disclosure where legally it could be done in terms of legislation, and we're not doing it.
And we're not doing it. Lee Fung, thank you so much for coming and talking to us a bit about your reporting. The rest are staying for more. And up next, President Obama has promised more transparency and open government, but some of his policies are kind of, well, you know, off the record for most of us. What's so wrong with that? Do we need to know everything? That's coming up.
You see tomorrow.